Let's begin in an unexpected place, not with tariffs, political speeches, or headlines, but with a map. Look at North America the way an economist might see it. Ignore the political borders for a moment and instead focus on the infrastructure that actually moves the economy: pipelines, freight rail corridors, highways, and one very important crossing, the Ambassador Bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario with Detroit, Michigan. It's only 4 lanes wide, but every day more than 300 million worth of goods pass across it. In fact, over a quarter of all trade between Canada and the United States moves over that single structure. By 2024, the economic relationship it represents was worth nearly $1.3 trillion annually. Now imagine policymakers staring at those numbers and deciding to disrupt that system. That's essentially what happened when the White House issued its executive orders in early 2025. The question that immediately follows is simple. Why would anyone deliberately destabilize one of the most integrated economic partnerships on Earth? My answer is that what unfolded wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a strategic misjudgment, an attempt by a dominant power to use economic pressure as leverage, while the country on the receiving end began quietly rethinking its dependence. To understand the moment, we need to step back and look at how the Canada-US relationship actually functioned for decades. Officially, it was always described as a partnership. In practice, it resembled a familiar pattern in global economics. One side specialized in supplying resources, while the other served as the main consumer and financial hub. Canada exported the fundamentals: energy, minerals, lumber, agricultural inputs, hydroelectric power. The United States provided the massive consumer market and the financial system that priced and financed those commodities. Both sides benefited. Canadian industries had reliable demand, while American manufacturers and households gained access to affordable inputs. Agreements like NAFTA and later the USMCA deepened that integration. Over 40 years, supply chains grew so interconnected that parts for a single automobile could cross the border multiple times before final assembly. But this arrangement rested on an unspoken reality. The imbalance in power was handled carefully and quietly. Canadian leaders understood that sending most of their exports to one country created vulnerability. So diplomacy between the two nations tended to be cautious, pragmatic, and deliberately non-confrontational. That balance shifted dramatically in February 2025. The U.S. government announced sweeping tariffs, 25% on many Canadian imports, and 10% on Canadian energy products. These weren't narrowly targeted policies. They affected a large portion of cross-border trade. Even observers in financial circles reacted with disbelief. Some commentators in major business publications openly described the move as economically irrational. The consequences appeared quickly. Canadian exports to the United States dropped sharply during the first months of the year. The Bank of Canada responded by lowering interest rates as uncertainty spread through the economy. Manufacturing centers tied closely to American supply chains, particularly in southern Ontario, felt the impact almost immediately. Factories slowed production, workers were laid off. Communities built around cross-border industry faced sudden instability. Yet, the tariffs themselves may not have been the ultimate goal. During the same period, the U.S. president repeatedly suggested that Canada should consider becoming part of the United States, describing the border as an arbitrary line and hinting that economic pressure could force political concessions. Statements like that fundamentally changed the tone of the relationship. Canadian security officials began describing American behavior in terms usually reserved for geopolitical competitors rather than allies. This is where Mark Carney's role becomes important. Carney isn't a typical political figure. Before entering public office, he built a career inside the global financial system, working at Goldman Sachs, and later serving as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. His professional reputation comes from managing financial crises and protecting institutional stability. So when he confronted the situation with Washington, his approach wasn't ideological, it was structural. In a meeting with the U.S. president during 2025, he calmly stated that Canada's sovereignty was not negotiable. Observers noted that he avoided theatrical confrontation and instead treated the conversation as a risk management exercise, almost as if the challenge was financial instability rather than political drama. A few months later, he delivered a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, describing a fracture in the global rules-based economic order. Many international policymakers responded enthusiastically. The U.S. administration, however, viewed the remarks as a direct challenge. What made the speech significant was what happened behind the scenes beforehand. In the weeks leading up to Davos, Carney traveled to Beijing and later to Brussels. Those trips were not about replacing the American market, something that would be impossible in the short term. Instead, they were about gradually reducing Canada's reliance on a single partner. The strategy was simple: diversify enough trade relationships so that Canada would no longer negotiate from a position of extreme dependency. During 2025, the first signs of that shift appeared. Canada increased exports to several new regions. European markets absorbed a larger share of Canadian goods, and trade with countries across Africa and Latin America expanded as well. One striking example involved the United Kingdom, which temporarily became Canada's second-largest export destination after a surge in gold shipments. Meanwhile, Canadian energy, uranium, and pharmaceutical products found new buyers in multiple countries. None of these changes fully replaced the American market, but they didn't need to. The objective was to rebalance leverage. Ironically, the very tariffs designed to pressure Canada ended up accelerating this diversification. Analysts at policy institutes later observed that policies meant to force economic submission instead encouraged greater independence. That doesn't mean the transition has been painless. Businesses that spent decades building supply chains around the U.S. market cannot reconfigure overnight. Workers who lost jobs in manufacturing centers are dealing with immediate financial realities rather than long-term strategic benefits. At the same time, it's important to recognize that economic dependence in North America has always been mutual. For example, parts of the northeastern United States rely on electricity imported from Canadian hydropower. American nuclear plants depend heavily on imported uranium, much of which originates in Canada. And many refineries in the U.S. Midwest were designed specifically to process Canadian crude oil. In other words, the relationship resembles an interconnected system rather than a simple hierarchy. Disruptions tend to affect both sides. All of this sets the stage for the upcoming review of the USMCA trade agreement in 2026. That review could lead in two very different directions. One possibility is a negotiated reset. Both governments could acknowledge the damage caused by the dispute and agree to rebuild a modified version of the old arrangement. Tariffs might be reduced, supply chains stabilized, and trade flows normalized, although likely under more explicit terms than before. The alternative is a gradual economic separation. If tensions persist, Canada could continue expanding trade partnerships elsewhere, while the United States shifts its own supply networks. Over time, the tightly integrated continental economy might evolve into two more distinct systems. My sense is that the second process has already begun in subtle ways. Once businesses invest in new logistics routes and sign long-term contracts with different partners, those changes rarely reverse quickly. Still, a hybrid outcome is also possible. A relationship that remains deeply interconnected but operates with far more strategic caution on both sides. Stepping back, the broader significance may extend beyond Canada itself. The dispute reflects larger pressures facing the American economic model: slowing growth, heavy consumer debt, and decades of industrial restructuring. Trade conflicts can sometimes emerge from those underlying tensions. Meanwhile, Canada has been pushed into reconsidering its economic strategy more aggressively than at any time in recent decades. The country that once relied overwhelmingly on a single market is now exploring a wider set of global partnerships. How this story ultimately ends will depend on negotiations, court rulings, and the decisions of policymakers in multiple capitals. But it will also depend on the everyday realities of workers, farmers, and energy producers whose livelihoods depend on stable trade flows. So the key question moving forward is this: when the next round of negotiations begins, will Canada approach the table with more bargaining power than it had before this crisis started, or less? The answer could shape the future of the entire North American economy for years to come.